Whether you're dreaming of a retirement with sand between your toes and a cold one in your hand, hitting the road to chase the winds of adventure, or spending time with your grandchildren, this show is intended to help you get there. Welcome to Coasting in Retirement with your host, Josh Knoll. You've worked too hard throughout your career to spend your retirement worrying. So sit back, kick up your feet, because we've got lots of financial tips and tricks to share to help you get exactly where you want to be. Here's Josh.
I'm your host, Josh Knoll, and I'm joined by my co-host, Michelle Lee Melton. Michelle, how you doing?
I've been better.
What's going on in your world?
I have a slab leak in my house.
Yes.
So tomorrow will be day 14 without water.
Yes.
So that is been trying.
Well, for
being a pioneer, it's fun for a day when you're using neighbors' water and stuff like that.
Gets old quick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It is old. It's
for listeners in the area, they're used to having their water pipes in the slab, the concrete slab down here, because there's no basements. People where I'm from, that's a little unusual. In Missouri, typically you have a basement, and you don't have a water pipe that is eventually going to corrode or freeze and bust like you did. So yes,
within a
slab, right? Well, let's see if we can make your day a little better.
Okay.
So listeners, after an extended Mardi Gras break, yeah, we're back for another great show today, recording yet again in our brand new state-of-the-art Jubilee Studios here in Daphne, Alabama. First, for those of you new to the show, I'm the owner of Gulf Coast Financial Advisors. It's an independent financial planning firm based out of downtown Fairhope, Alabama. We serve clients up and down the Gulf Coast. You can learn more about us at our website at gulfcoastfa.com, and we will repeat our contact info several times throughout the show. As always, Michelle and I are here to discuss financial topics relevant to those in or near retirement, living their best life along our part of the Gulf Coast. Well, so today, Michelle and I are going to finish up part 2 of a 2-part series we called 5 Ways for Retirees to Generate Income in Retirement. In the first part of the episode, we laid out the 3 ways to generate income in our last episode, and today we're going to discuss the last 2. So for you listeners that want to hear our previous discussion, simply go to Spotify and search for Coasting in Retirement and locate episode 6. You'll hear the first part of this 2-part series. Michelle and I felt it was important to discuss ways to produce income in some depth because income tends to be something that's pretty near and dear to all of us. When you're still working and you're collecting a paycheck, generating income can be as simple as getting out of bed and going to work. But what happens when you're no longer working? You still need to generate some type of income, or at least most people do. So what are some ways to do that? We put together what we think were 5 pretty solid ways, ideas and concepts for you all to consider. And what we're going to do is we'll discuss ways to use both your investment assets and possibly your real estate holdings to generate this income and hopefully passive income. But first, let's do this. Let's refresh everyone's memory by providing the full list of 5 ways to generate income in retirement. And before I turn it over to Michelle to provide that list, I want to add a short disclaimer. We did this on the last episode too. Just like we said last week, this list is by no means meant to be a complete or exhaustive list of generating income in retirement. For example, some folks in retirement lend money to the younger working generation, similar to like a bank lending money to a borrower, except it obviously being a private transaction. And they do that typically for agreed upon interest rate. And that example right there is going to fit the definition of generating income in retirement, but it's not something I would call a common method, if you will. Given that we've only got a little less than an hour to get to all of our great information, we're going to keep our list to strategies that should be familiar and accessible for most investors. And as always, we're going to steer clear of any golden ticket strategies. And I want to remind everyone that all investments, no matter what anyone tells you, involve some form of risk. Last note before we get back to our list, as you will learn in this episode, most financial advisors, including me, use some combination of these strategies to spread the risk, often is what is called the bucket approach. All right, so with all that said, Michelle, would you be so kind as to lay out our complete list of 5 ways to generate income in retirement? And just a quick note, after you do that, we'll dive in it deeper on the last 2. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so here are the 5 in no particular order. First off, an investment account designed using what is called the, quote, total return approach, unquote. Second is income annuities. 2 is real estate investment trusts or REITs. 4, laddering bonds and or certificates of deposits, not compact discs,
Right.
also known as CDs.
That's right.
And the 5th one's rental properties, such as Airbnb, Vrbo, etc.
Okay. Is it Verbo or VRBO?
I say Verbo. I mean, because that's just it's too complicated.
I like VRBO. It's easier on my overbite to pronounce. Is that
I think
wrong?
Verbo just rolls off.
All right. Well, you're usually right on these things, so we'll go with Verbo. All right. So very good, Michelle. So let's start with number 4 on that list: laddering bonds and or CDs, not compact discs, but certificates of deposit.
I do have a ladder of compact discs still.
As we'll touch on a little bit later in our episode. We're going to talk on bank CDs and brokerage CDs, but for now, Michelle, just a basic question for you. Do you have any personal experience with bonds, CDs, anything along that nature?
Government bonds.
Government bonds. Okay. And probably at some point, like if you were like me, you remember as we were kids of the 80s, our grandparents would mention bonds, right?
Correct.
Yep. Very good. So let's do this. Let's start with defining what it means when we say laddering bonds or CDs. This is the basic layout. And understand this, listeners, bond and CD laddering are kind of kissing cousins of the same strategy. In fact, sometimes you'll see an investor use both in the same portfolio. More or less, an investor purchases multiple bonds or CDs with different maturities. As each bond or CD matures, they reinvest the principal in new bonds with a term period that is originally chosen for the latter. So, for example, if interest rates move higher in general in the market, and you've got some of the CDs or bonds invested at certain rates, you can, once those hit their maturity date, you can turn around and reinvest that hopefully at a higher rate. Consequently, if rates fall, hopefully you still have some bonds locked in for the longer term at higher yields. The latter part refers to the portfolio of individual CDs or bonds that they're basically going to be set up to mature on different dates. This strategy is really designed to provide current income while also trying to at least somewhat minimize exposure to interest rate fluctuations. Instead of buying bonds that are scheduled to mature during the same year, or purchase CDs or bonds that mature at the same time, what you're going to do is you're going to stagger those around on future dates. Spreading out the maturity dates typically can help investors from trying to time the market. It's not something necessarily that modern day investors use exclusively. It was something that you saw more prevalent when Michelle and I were kids in the 80s when interest rates were higher. However,
so is the hair.
That's right. The hair and the interest rates were higher. And as we've discussed on previous episodes, what has happened with a rising interest rate environment is you're now seeing what most people would consider at least relatively attractive rates being offered on certificates of deposits and higher yields and so on and so forth with the bonds, where people are starting to do the laddering system again. So back to our point. Basically, what an investor is trying to do with the laddering system is manage both interest rate risk and cash flow. You're staggering the maturity dates. You're trying to avoid getting locked into a single interest rate. You're trying to help smooth out the fluctuations in the interest rates. And again, normally, at least for the last 10 to 15 years, interest rates have stayed fairly stable and fairly low. This is once again part of a topic because we have pretty dynamic interest rate environment and a pretty dynamic rising interest rate environment. So here we are back again. When the bond would mature or the CD would mature, you would reinvest the principal in a new longer term bond or another CD at the end of the ladder, so on and so forth. One little side note, many bonds will pay interest twice a year on dates that generally will kind of coincide with the maturity date. So what a lot of times people will do in a ladder system is they will structure predictable monthly bond income based on what's called the coupon payment with different maturity months as well as years. And it's called a ladder because it's kind of a metaphor, an analogy. I don't know. I didn't pay as much attention to English as I did math, but they call it a ladder because there's rungs. The rungs would be the interest rate environment that you're putting the laddering system in. There's spacing, how long are the maturity dates. The materials that refers to are used bonds, or you have municipal bonds, government bonds, so on and so forth, bank CDs, brokerage CDs, so on and so forth. That's why it's called a ladder. All right, so moving on. So that was number 4 way to generate income in retirement. That was laddering bonds and CDs. Let's get to our last item on the list, investing in real estate properties to generate income in retirement. So for the record, I am a financial advisor. I'm not someone that helps people invest in real estate like a real estate agent would do, but many of my clients have real estate properties. And it absolutely becomes a key part of their financial planning process that we work through at Gulf Coast Financial Advisors. Before I dive into my opinion or my thoughts on real estate investing as not a real estate investing expert, Michelle, I got a question for you. I know that you've used Airbnb on the consumer side.
Love it.
Yes, but do you have any experience on the landlord side?
I do.
Okay. Tell us just a brief little bit about it.
Well, I enjoyed it. I had a separate dwelling behind my principal dwelling, and it was all in one, and I allowed pets, and I had little welcome baskets that were from this area, and it was great. It generated income, not enough to make me pay taxes on it, which was great.
Okay.
But it was relatively easy, and in some cases, you could rent it out when we have events here for a lot, and then that would pay for a hotel stay somewhere else.
Right.
For me,
Yes.
if I wanted to do that. But I had a separate dwelling anyway, but I know that people do that successfully. I think a lot of the Airbnbs that we use in New Orleans and stuff like that might be somebody's main residence, and then we go there and they go to the Ritz for the weekend.
Agreed,
so.
right. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to piggyback off of that. So when we talk about being a landlord in this episode and using companies like Airbnb or
I will say it's really easy to set those things up too with Airbnb and VRBO.
Right.
They're easy. The platforms are real easy.
Well, what we'll do, we'll keep the conversation around single family. The most common type of landlord is single family. Most of the time when we're renting something, we're renting a single family. Of course, there's condos and things like that. But for most folks, particularly the folks that are maybe looking at generating income or retirement from using this type of rental system, a lot of times they're looking at renting out their previous primary residence, or like Michelle said, looking at maybe kind of juggling between the two if possible. Okay. So plus we're going to distinguish between short-term rentals and long-term rentals. Now, short-term rentals historically have been defined as 90 days or less. But again, as Michelle mentioned, the company Airbnb and Vrbo, they really, in my opinion, they've reduced that time period to like a week or less, right? Typically when you go in an Airbnb, you're a week or less, long weekend, maybe even an individual night. I think that's kind of changed things. And really in my opinion, there's been two things that have happened in the single family rental market, and both of them involve tech. For the short-term rentals, which again, historically was 90 days or less, long-term rentals would have been, your 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 year leases. What you've seen in the long term is the rise of real estate management companies. This has really made it much more realistic for everyday investors to rent a property. Historically, most small landlords needed to also know how to do a lot of maintenance on their own. And while that's probably obviously can still be true in some areas, most robust rental markets like our part of the Gulf Coast have several qualified property management options. The underlying tech that these companies use make it so much easier for the property owner to have an arm's length relationship to the tenant, which has been a landlord before, that is absolutely desirable typically. And then consequently in the short-term rental, I would argue that companies like Airbnb and Vrbo have had a similar effect on the industry as Uber has had on the yellow cab industry. And here's what I mean by that. It's very common for someone that is traveling to shop both hotels and Airbnbs in an area they're traveling to and compare and contrast the two, which was something that was, in my opinion, unheard of, 10-ish years ago before this technology came around. And then, of course, if they're traveling in a large group, I personally think that a single family residence will beat out a separate hotel room accommodations any day. That's my opinion. What do you think on that?
I like it. I like it. I mean, I'm pro the vacation home rentals. I travel with a pet or more than one pet, and I like to have a whole place to myself.
And it seems like there's more flexibility in that market, right?
Yes, I agree. I mean, yeah, because there's some cities, both hotels, you have to book at least 2 nights.
Right.
Even around here.
Well, so I think the main point is, as back to our topic of the day, how to ways to generate income in retirement, is that tech and the rise of support groups for landlords and property investment companies has made it quite a bit more realistic to become a landlord, to invest in rental properties. But also, I'll say this, just know that if you're getting into that side of the business, you're going to be dealing with things such as a Schedule E on your tax return. You're going to have ordinary taxable income. You're going to have potential capital gains.
1098E?
Maybe. But I'm not a CPA. You're going to have potential capital gains if you sell the investment property. So definitely consider adding a CPA to your financial team in addition to your financial advisor. All right. So Michelle, let's do this. Let's close out this segment. We're going to do a little call to action for any of you listeners that have questions or concerns about your current investment strategy, or maybe you're just not comfortable doing it yourself, or you want to have a conversation about ways to generate income. Just remember, at Gulf Coast Financial Advisors, we offer both investment management and comprehensive financial planning services. So for those in or near retirement, here is our basic process. First, we figure out how much you'll need for the retirement you've been dreaming about. Next, we uncover the main risks posing a threat to your retirement, including inflation, stock market volatility, that's Michelle's favorite word, potential tax increases, yes.
Yeah. It's hard.
Volatility.
VRBO,
Verbo, who knows. Then we'll discuss options for generating income in retirement and putting your investment portfolio to work doing specific jobs such as battling inflation. And finally, we're going to discuss how to keep your current standard of living in retirement even as costs keep rising. These strategies we use, they're designed in part to help you with income production as well as inflation and longevity risks. And really what we're trying to do is to match your risk tolerance with your investment holdings and to help make sure that you do not end up outliving your retirement savings. Again, so if you're interested in having that conversation, why don't you give us a call at 251-333-5151, or you can find us at gulfcoastfa.com. That's gulfcoastfa.com, gulfcoastfa.com. All right, folks, coming up next, there's always a lot going on in the world, particularly the world of finance. Every week, Michelle and I scour the interwebs for helpful financial articles that are related to our topic of the day, especially articles that pertain to those in or near retirement. So I want you all to join us after the break to hear Michelle and I discuss this week's relevant headlines in our Michelle with the News of the Week segment. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Michelle from Coasting in Retirement, a show that you might have heard on Sundays at noon. If you're looking to inflation-proof your retirement and are ready to take that next step, but don't want to wait for one of those upcoming seminars, just give the advisors at Gulf Coast a call today and schedule your no-obligation sit-down with Josh and his team. Maybe it's time for that second opinion after all. Call 251-333-5151 or visit us on the web at gulfcoastfa.com. And make sure to listen on Sundays at noon right here on the Talk 106.5.
Advisory services offered through Prime Capital Investment Advisors, LLC, a federally registered investment advisor. PCIA 6201, College Boulevard, Suite 150, Overland Park, Kansas 66211. PCIA doing business as Prime Capital Wealth Management and Qualified Plan Advisors. PCIA and Gulf Coast Financial Advisors are not affiliated.
Welcome back to Coasting in Retirement. Your host, Josh Knoll here. As we discussed before the break, every week, Michelle and I scour the interwebs, her word, for helpful financial articles related to our topic of the day, particularly articles that pertain to those in or near retirement. So Coasting in Retirement's co-host Michelle and I are going to help you all understand and hopefully decipher the deeper meaning of some of these headlines, or at the very least, we will provide some context. So without further ado, here's Michelle with the news of the week.
All right, Josh, we're going to start with a new site we found called Bankrate. This article is titled, quote, "A Retiree's Guide to Hosting on Airbnb," unquote. So this article states that the average Airbnb investors made $13,800 during 2021. I actually did some further digging, and it appears this number jumps around a little bit on different sites. But, as it were, all available data still points to the fact that Airbnb can be a viable source of rental income. And I can say that I've hosted an Airbnb in the past and found that it worked reasonably well. And what do you think about this as it relates to investors interested in rental income for retirement?
Well, very good. So, Michelle, this ties into our fifth point that we made about how to generate income in retirement. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about the quote-unquote old way of being a landlord. So you've got some experience with being an Airbnb. I've got some experience with being a landlord. So a residential, single-family residential landlord plus a commercial landlord. Let's start with this. In the old way of being a landlord, you bought a property. We'll use single-family residential for the example. Probably you fixed it up. You found a renter. You were hoping that person would rent it for at least a year, if not longer. You kind of crossed your fingers on the type of renter they would be. And then all too often you watched the renter inflict some wear and tear on the property. And then, sometimes in some occasions you had to occasionally chase the rent check. Not that this still doesn't happen for small landlords, but two things have developed, particularly over the past 10 years, and really three things that make being a real estate investor much more realistic for the average person. First, tech has allowed the average landlord to not only do a deep dive on someone's background, probably deeper than we're all comfortable with, but they can, but to also put in systems where their relationship with the tenant can be at arm's length to some degree, because that's usually a lot of the problem. Again, this personal experience, you get a little too attached to the renter, you let them slide on some stuff, and next thing you know, everything's kind of going to heck in a handbasket. Two, real estate management companies have sprung up to serve in the landlord capacity for investors. There are many management companies, especially down our part of the Gulf Coast, that will come in. If you've got a rental property, they will come in and make sure the maintenance is done, make sure they collect the check, handle the day-to-day activities or issues with the tenant, so on and so forth. Now, when you do that, you do give up a bite of the apple, the rental income apple, but often when they handle the everyday tenant problems for you, the management company, it takes a significant burden off your back. And then three, the bonus one, if you will, for folks that are in areas that allow it, as Michelle's previous experience did, particularly vacation destinations like our part of the Gulf Coast, sites like Airbnb and VRBO and the like have completely changed the income potential of owning a rental unit. What I mean by that, you can rent a property for some set amount of dollars per month if you're in the right area, and again, if the area allows it and you have enough demand, you can 2 times, 3 times, maybe 4 times, whatever the number is, that steady income, you can go above and beyond with folks that are willing to pay a little bit of a premium to have that property for a long weekend, for the week, wherever it may be. And that has really, really changed the status. In my opinion, having been a landlord 20 years ago, I am way more comfortable jumping back into that market now than I was back then. If you'd asked me 20 years ago if I wanted to be a landlord again, right off the bat, I'd said, heck no. Now, as we're getting back into those types of things, we definitely are much more comfortable because there's much more structure in place. So that's a great article, Michelle. What you got next?
Okay. And I will say it was easy to sign up for
yours
Airbnb.
Was a great one, right?
Yeah.
And we use it on the buyer side.
Yeah, and it was easy to sign up through Airbnb and Vrbo and all those stuff, and I did mine, and I had local baskets, welcome baskets, which the article goes into suggesting, so that
Very
went
good.
far, I think, so I was a super host.
You were a super host.
Yes.
Still a super host in my eyes.
According to Airbnb, I was a super host.
Very good.
And I've stayed at some not so great Airbnbs too.
Yeah, I hear you.
And I've been vocal about it, so. Okay. So next up is back to our buddy Investopedia.
Yes.
Investopedia.
You like that. Kind
It is a lot of syllables. I like it. Their site has a recent article titled 4 Sources of Income for Your Retirement. What, Investopedia? It's supposed to be odd numbers. And since I go off on tangents about this, I actually did some additional research and looked into the psychology of numbers.
Okay.
And some nerdler is also hung up on odd numbers and did all this research across the world in different countries and whatnot. And he said 49% of the people he asked like the number 7 the best.
Like number 7 the best.
They were all odd numbers. He asked them 1 through 10. 5's too easy because it's in the middle. Hardly anybody picked evens. 49% overwhelmingly 7. And when you think about it, it's kind of ingrained in us. There's 7 continents. There's 7 senses. There's 7 natural wonders of the world. So I'm just saying, Investopedia, we need to write them a little memo to let them know.
I like it. And if
And
my
5
mom's
just
listening,
sounds cool too.
Yeah.
5 instead of 4.
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, if my mom's listening, the math consultant, she's thrilled because she's all about numbers and all that stuff. So, well, what did the article say?
Okay, well, it reads 4, but we know how I feel about that. So it reads 4 ways to generate income in retirement, and it gives more options than 4, which is good, even though it's called 4 sources. That said, this article discussed a concept you discussed in the opening, systematically laddering CDs.
Certificates of deposit.
Yes, not compact discs.
Right.
Takes me a while to get used to that. So, I actually did kind of do this back in my 30s.
Okay.
And I did the laddering one.
So just a couple years ago is what you're saying.
Totes, right. So I did that. I don't currently have any CDs that I'm aware of. If I do, they've definitely matured and they're in the safe somewhere. But anyway, but can you explain more about laddering, not compact discs, but certificates of deposit, please?
Oh, absolutely. So first, let's do this. Let's describe the two broad types of certificates of deposits, which we'll refer to as CDs at this point, not the music type. The first type is a bank CD. That's typically what people think about when they refer to a CD. That's where you go in, you buy a CD for a certain time period in exchange for a guaranteed interest rate from the bank. They are typically, as long as the bank is FDIC insured, they're going to be FDIC insured up to $250,000. Wow, I'm struggling with that.
FDIC.
Thank you. FDIC?
No, not INC. No N.
Well, I like my version better. But so FDIC insured up to $250,000 as long as it's an FDIC insured bank, right? Thank you. Which I believe most banks are at this point. Brokerage CDs are sold through brokers and/or broker dealers, which, just to be honest with the listeners, I don't have my FINRA registration anymore. I don't affiliate with a broker dealer, so I don't do brokerage CDs anymore. Either way, they look, smell, and taste pretty similar. The ones that you buy through a brokerage, as long as the brokerage is partnering with a federally insured bank, they will still have the same FDIC coverage up to $250,000. But you definitely want to check the fine print on that if you are buying a brokerage CD. Make sure that the underlying company is, or the underlying bank that is servicing it, has that insurance. So that's first. Second, let's compare rates over the past, say, 20, 30 years with current rates. So per annuityexpertadvice.com, that's a site that you and I have referenced before. He calls himself the annuity expert. Good for him. The average rate of a CD in the early 1980s, when we were just babies, was 12%. And I think it actually, in many cases, it probably went higher than that. Either way, this rate started decreasing over the ensuing decades, in large part because of good things, if you will. Inflation remained pretty mild during that time period. Once we got past the early 80s, we got mid 80s and later, interest rates were easing, and really we had a almost historical period of historically low interest rates. Well, what happened is CDs in the early 2000s, the interest rates that they would offer started to rapidly decrease until we entered a period during this past decade where CD rates were not that attractive, say 1% to 2%. So again, we are recording this February 2023. Everybody kind of has an idea what's going on with inflation, what's going on with interest rates. CDs are now kind of back on the mind of investors. In fact, Michelle, I did just a brief Google search because, again, I don't deal with CDs too much other than on the retail side for myself, if you will. But Capital One is offering 5% on one of their CDs. So what people are doing, again, now, what they used to do in the past, they would buy CDs in a ladder system. All that means is you had the CDs maturing at different time periods. That way you did not have all of your money locked up at one time. You created a little bit of liquidity. And back when CD rates were pretty attractive, particularly in the 80s, this was a great way to generate income in retirement. It's been a terrible way to generate income in retirement over the past decade or so up until now. And again, it's one of those things, it's a double-sided coin because yes, it's great for retirees that the CD rates are higher, but it's kind of rough on the rest of the economy that interest rates are higher as well. They go hand in hand. So that's a great find. All right, what you got next?
Okay, we're going to pivot to Forbes. And Forbes has an article titled How to Create a Paycheck for Retirement. And this article discusses single premium immediate annuities, which goes by my favorite acronym, SPIA.
Very good. SPIAs.
Yes. And I think I need a SPIA because you'll tell us about it, but they have consistent payouts. I don't have any heirs. Who cares? And then you can buy and pay more money up front for inflation is what I learned. So anyway, but SPIA. So my guess is that the part I want to discuss probably hurts the average investor's brain a little because it certainly hurt mine. So Forbes lays out the difference between interest and dividend investing and total return investing. And it seems like these two concepts have a bit of overlap. But what are the primary difference between the two, and why does this matter to investors in retirement?
All right, so we touched on this in the opening segment, but let's go ahead and rehash it. Let's start by using just a general investment account to generate income in retirement. what you mentioned, Michelle, there's two broad ways of doing this. The first is generally referred to as interest and dividend investing. The idea is to create interest from bond investments and hopefully dividend payments from stocks that can distribute corporate profits or distribute dividends. The goal with this type of investing is to set up consistent payouts on a monthly, quarterly basis, whatever the investor needs, with hopefully not having to sell the underlying investments that generate the income. The issue and what they discuss a little bit at length there in that Forbes, that's Forbes, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Forbes article is with interest and dividend investing. First, it takes a pretty good chunk of change to generate a high payout. Especially with bond yields, again, we're in a little bit of a unique period compared to the last 10 to 15 years. Bond yields go up with interest. So last 10, 15 years, for the majority of the time, bond yields were not great. It was scratch and claw to generate yield. You got higher interest rates, you got higher bond yields. It's becoming a little bit more attractive again. But you couple that with if interest rates start going down, if inflation goes down, then we'll be back in a scratch and claw situation on bond yields. Now, if you add in the dividends from the stocks, remember bonds are a debt type of instrument. You're lending the government, you're lending a municipality. That's a big word I have a hard time with because of my overbite. You're lending a corporation money in exchange for some type of interest, the yield. On the flip side of that, dividends are related to stocks. They are going to be things where they are paying out some of the profits that they guarantee that they generate, as long as they are a company that is in a dividend producing mode. Typically, growth companies like tech companies are going to keep their capital in house because they're going to reinvest it. Dividends usually are a little bit more blue blood, if you will. Think Ford, think car manufacturers, think Walmart, things like that. Companies, even with that said, companies like that will cut or eliminate dividend payments during rough economic patches. They will circle the wagons, if you will. And what happens often is investors will start hunting for yield in that situation, which is why that we use the dividend and interest part of the portfolio. Fine, it's kind of an old school way, if you will. What I consider, and I consider alone, this may or may not agree with the rest of the market, but I consider what is an evolution of that strategy is called total return approach. Total return approach is basically a fancy way of describing a diversified portfolio of stock and bond funds. The goal is part of your portfolio is generating the income, like we talked about with the dividend interest, but also the other part is hopefully generating some room for capital appreciation, which matters to the longevity of said portfolio. Because remember, the retirement spending rules that you've heard many advisors and commentators mention, the 4% withdrawal rule, that is based on total return investing, not dividend and income investing. Good job, Forbes, and good job, Michelle. What's next?
Okay, so now we're going to pivot to Fidelity's site, but before we get into the article, remind us, isn't Fidelity one of your custodians that you use?
Well, it is, yeah. So custodian is a fancy way of saying where is the money housed. We use Fidelity. We also use Charles Schwab. We're pretty agnostic as to which one a investor or client will pick, but I will tell you not to pick on Fidelity. They tend to nickel and dime a little bit more than Schwab. Schwab, if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly from my history lesson, from all my teachings, came along and was the first quote-unquote discount brokerage, and they kept the fees low, and you kind of see that has played out over time. So, yes, you're 100% accurate, Michelle.
All right, cool. So, sounds good. Now, on to the Fidelity article, very simply titled Retirement Income Strategies, which I note also had 4 strategies as opposed to 5. So, anyway. This article has a lot of information that collaborates with some of our other headline articles. So, let's focus on the part where Fidelity discusses having an investment portfolio with guarantees. What do they mean by the guarantee part?
Okay, well, I'll hit this one pretty quick because what Fidelity undoubtedly is referring to here is how a lot of times when you are looking for a guarantee part of an investor's or retiree's portfolio, you're wanting to point towards things like Social Security. You're wanting to point, well, I say that we're one day removed from the State of the Union, and that was an interesting conversation about Social Security for sure. But anyway, back to the main point, you're wanting to point to things that are at least somewhat, to some degree, you can look at and say, okay, this is a guaranteed part of my investment portfolio for income production. Social Security, pensions, and then in Fidelity's case, they're talking about annuities, which we've talked about at length in this episode, right?
Our friend annuities.
Yeah, income annuities. Now, understand, investors, listeners, that the for an insurance-backed annuity, it is the payment, the guarantee of the payment coming is only tied to the ability and willingness of the insurance company to make said payment. Now, that said, most insurance companies that play in this market are pretty large, pretty huge actually, and globally, and they have a long track record of meeting the promises that they give on an income annuity. But so what they're talking about is having an investment portfolio with guarantees. It kind of goes back to the bucket thing where this would fall into the income bucket, what Fidelity is referring to as a guaranteed part. So very good. Good job, Fidelity, and good job, Michelle. We got one more?
Yes, we do. Okay, back to those fools at Motley. And it is Mardi Gras time, so we have jesters running about amongst us all over the place. So I'm glad we included them. So also, it is called Motley Fool.
Is it Motley Crue?
Yeah, I wish it was Motley Crue.
The second greatest hair metal band after Winger.
They probably could have used the Motley Fool back in the day because I think they blew a lot of their stuff back in the 80s and early 90s.
They definitely needed a financial advisor.
And some other advisors. Yeah. Okay. So Motley Fool has an article titled, what is it? 8 Best Strategies for Retirement Income. Turns out Motley Fool are a whole bunch of fools. Just kidding. But odd numbers are better. Please listen to the first thing about the psychology of numbers. Okay. So there are 2 parts I want to discuss about this article. First, they discuss delaying Social Security to maximize the payout, which sounds good to me. But second, and this has come up before, they discuss working a part-time job in retirement. No, thank you. I don't like that part at all, but I wanted to hear your take on both of them. And also on, when I read this article, it had 2 very nice older people on a very nice boat.
There you go. Yeah.
So that encouraged me even more. So I did power through the 8, not 9 best strategies for retirement income.
Very good.
To get up on a boat.
Well, let's talk about the first part, the Social Security. So anyone that has looked at their Social Security projection statement knows that the benefit gets higher every year they delay taking Social Security. What most folks don't know, Michelle, is that once you reach full retirement age, and that's typically between age 65 to 67, you get an extra 2/3 of 1% for each month you delay after your birthday month. The simple math on that is it adds up to 8% increase for each full year you wait until age 70. So I've said this before, it's just my opinion. This is the only, and I mean the only investment you can kind of squint at and say it gives you a guaranteed 8% return if you can just hang on and not put your hands in a cookie jar. Now, here's the thing. It's not that simple. And as we've said so many times on this show, nothing in investing is guaranteed, even when it comes to the government. But when you add in the fact that Social Security also has to accommodate cost of living adjustments, there's typically a tipping point to where the additional benefits from waiting will mathematically outweigh the payments received from starting Social Security earlier. All right. So that's the first answer or first comment I have on the article you found. Now, the second one, that's a little bit more squishy. Compare and contrast those that want to work part-time in retirement versus those that don't. I'm pointing at somebody right now, Michelle. She's done. When she retires, that's it. She's out.
I want it to be next week, but that's not bloody likely. But
where somebody,
I don't want to be 65. I don't want to work till I'm 65.
I hear you. Right. And so, and some people retire and they get a little fidgety and they go back to work. And then some people have to do some part-time stuff to meet their income needs or to get access to certain benefits. Either way, what they're trying to say in this article is kind of keep your options open and also pay attention closely to your Social Security projections. Try to do what you can to maximize the timing and the value of that. Delaying it's not for everybody because you could delay it to age 69 and lo and behold you turn around, you die at age 70, right? So there's conversation being had there. But some folks will tie this into our real estate investment conversation, Michelle. Some people's part-time job might just be simply maintaining an investment property or properties. So great job.
Paying somebody else to do it.
Paying somebody else to do it. Great job, Motley Fool.
Mardi Gras.
Mardi Gras, all right. Well, Michelle, great job as always with the headlines. These are all important pieces of information that impacts our listeners.
Buckets and ladders, buckets and ladders.
There you go. For our listeners that want to have a little bit more discussion about these topics and interested in learning more about our strategies, why don't you contact us at Gulf Coast Financial Advisors at 251-333-5151 or find us online at gulfcoastfa.com. All right, folks, coming up after the break, we get to have a little fun, and undoubtedly I'll get picked on yet again a little bit by my co-host Michelle.
Indeed.
In our next segment, we call it Where Josh Nailed It, where Josh was a little off. And so let me provide a little context. I've always had pretty strong opinions, and I can prove it. My son Peyton recently dug up some old English writing papers that I wrote back in high school.
Why Josh still has those, no one knows.
Because I'm proud of what I said. So I wrote those when I was his age now, and yeah, I do come off a little precocious, but I wasn't always wrong, mind you. I'm actually proud of some of the things I believed in coming up on 30 years ago in high school. So the point of that is we're going to go back. We're not going back 30 years on those opinions, good Lord. But we are going to go back a few years. We're going to share some opinions I've made public as an adult. And some of those opinions prove fairly accurate. And for balance, some of them were, I didn't quite stick the landing because I am human. So see you after the break for Where Josh Nailed It, where Josh was a little off.
Hi, Michelle here. If you're looking to inflation-proof your retirement and are ready to take that next step, but don't want to wait for one of those upcoming seminars, just give the advisors at Gulf Coast Financial Advisors a call today and schedule your no-obligation in-person review with Josh and his team. Maybe it's time for that second opinion. Make sure to call 251-333-5151 or visit us on the web at gulfcoastfa.com. That's GULFCOASTFA as in financialadvisors.com.
Advisory services offered through Prime Capital Investment Advisors, LLC, a federally registered investment advisor. PCIA 6201 College Boulevard, Suite 150, Overland Park, Kansas 66211. PCIA doing business as Prime Capital Wealth Management and Qualified Plan Advisors. PCIA and Gulf Coast Financial Advisors are not affiliated.
All right, welcome back. So the point of Coasting in Retirement is to offer general financial guidance and education to those in or near retirement, which means I often give my professional opinion. So as I've stated previously, I'm proud of the thought, care, and due diligence that I put into giving said professional opinion, both on this show and in my financial planning practice, but I'm also human, and which means that I don't always stick the landing and I'm always learning and evolving. So each week, Michelle and I, we get to poke a little fun at myself by admitting any thoughts or opinions I put out there that weren't 100% on point, but also to be fair, pointing to some of the things that were pretty accurate. I'm not a soothsayer, but sometimes I have some opinion. Not yet. So we call this segment Where Josh Nailed It, where Josh was a little off. All right, Michelle, what's first?
Okay. Josh, you say that even though you were just a youngster in the early 80s, you still paid attention to interest rates because, one, you've always been a nerd.
Truth.
And two, your dad was in construction. You paid attention to the rates he was getting on construction and equipment loans. I don't completely buy that because that sounds so not riveting for a child, but you can
see point number one.
Okay.
Nerd.
I will let you try to convince me otherwise. So, having lived through that time period, albeit just a wee person, you stated publicly that you didn't see how there was any way both inflation and interest rates would rise to the levels of the late 1970s and early 80s. So, did you nail it on this opinion, or were you just a wee bit off?
Well, all right, so context, Michelle, as bad as the inflation conversation has gotten over the past few months.
That's all everybody talks about.
Right. It's eased up a little bit, but it's still lingering out there. And even as high as the bank and brokerage CD interest rate offerings have become, as of today, when we're recording this, February 2023, happy Mardi Gras, everybody, we are still nowhere close to both the inflation rate or bank interest rates from that time period for late 70s, early 80s. And again, I referenced this in the previous segment. The Annuity Expert site, bank CD interest rates averaged about 12% in the early 80s. So the point of that is, even with that, even what we're saying, first, yes, I nailed it so far, because the highest rate I could find through a simple Google search was Capital One offering 5% on the CDs. Inflation is still not as high as it was during that time period. Interest rates are still not as high as they were during that time period. And here's my opinion, Michelle. Forgive me if I go off the reservation a little bit, but I don't remember the particular years before you and I were born. I want to say it's 1973. Some of our listeners that were alive during that time period can tell me, but the United States came off the gold standard. And one of the
Wizard of Oz.
Right. And one of the key things that they were really worried about was inflation. Well, guess what? They were
Here
right.
we are.
Right. And again, I'm going to show my age a little bit because I was just a kid. Even though I was paying attention to my dad's construction notes, I wasn't paying attention to the government as much. But we had a Federal Reserve that came in and basically broke the back of inflation. And that's what you saw with that. So the point of that, fast forward to today, I feel like things are a little bit more in tune. Not that I totally agree with how they handled it. I think they should have jumped on the inflation earlier. And I think also government was a big reason why the inflation problem was caused from the beginning. However, I've held that I don't think it'll get as bad as late 70s or early 80s. And so far, I have nailed it on that.
All right. Well, this is an opinion I've heard you express multiple times, both privately and publicly. While annuities can be a useful tool to generate income in retirement, they are not the end-all, be-all, and should be researched thoroughly and purchased carefully. You seem to have a particular sore spot for salespeople that try to hoover up most, if not all, of the available assets an investor may have. So in sum, annuities, not the golden ticket, they are sometimes made out to be. Are they or are they not?
I nailed her a little off.
Yeah.
Nailed it. So here's the thing. Unlike my previous landlord real estate investment opinion, this is an opinion that I don't see myself ever really deviating from. Let me give you some context. Someone could hear me just make that statement or respond to what you said, Michelle, and they could lump me in with all the other commentators out there saying that, quote unquote, all annuities are bad. I would encourage our listeners to go back to our episode 3. You can find it on Spotify by searching Coasting Retirement. And you can hear me explain why slapping this broad of a statement on all annuities is really silly at best and disingenuous at worst. The annuities, there are very different types of annuities. They all have different purposes. Some of them bleed over into the others. Deferred annuity, SPIAs, which is one of Michelle's favorite type, or favorite type to say anyway. SPIA, right? So really what irritates me, and I try not to pick on my brother, and some of them do a really good job, but definitely what you will see out there is someone will come in and on an investment portfolio, they will take a significant amount of the assets available and stick them into an annuity and tell them that they got nothing to worry about. That everything's going to be taken care of. These, and even you and I, Michelle, in past episodes have picked on some of the advertising on said annuities. Guaranteed 8.5% return, which is just it bothers me that that's even allowed to be put in print. Right. So my thing is, it's not the golden ticket. They have a purpose. Call me the split the baby guy. We do use them, but we use them for a very specific reason. And we always have investors walking in completely wide-eyed on what they're getting into, the pros and the cons. And we definitely don't sit there and do the carnival barking thing where we're selling a particular product as the golden ticket that's going to solve all your financial woes. Because that, honestly, listeners, that product doesn't exist. It never has, and never will. Right. So, all right, Michelle, you got one more?
We do. Okay, you stated before that just like with annuities, REITs,
real estate investment trusts,
that's right, are an investment choice that should be researched before being bought. To get into the weeds a little further, you've directed this commentary specifically towards non-traded REITs. Can you explain your opinion a little more in depth and let us know if you nailed it or were you a little bit off?
Okay. Well, I think this one is definitely where I've been a little bit of both, to be fair. So we're not going to go through the whole REIT dissertation. We did that in a previous segment. We will give you a little bit of pros and cons. Traded REITs in general are going to be traded on an exchange, and they have at least some version of liquidity versus non-traded REITs, which, again, there's a purpose for them. It's not that they are a bad product per se, but there are definitely some things that investors need to know about before they walk into a non-traded REIT. Primarily, you're losing quite a bit of control with the capital that you're putting into a non-traded REIT. And it's not every time, but there are instances where the payout from the REIT maybe is reduced. The value of the REIT can go down significantly if the underlying assets in said REIT go down significantly. The example we've always used in the past has been with enclosed shopping malls. Probably not a great business to be in right now, except maybe for some particular markets. But on the flip side of that, Michelle, what has happened, and I don't know exactly what year because it just came on my radar a couple of years ago, but there is a rise of exchanges that help people get out of or buy and sell non-traded REITs. The one that I use that the investment company that I work with has given us the ability to work with is called Realto.ai. That's REALTO.ai. And it's not a perfect system necessarily because there still has to be a buyer on the other side. And if you've got a non-traded REIT that's damaged enough, it's going to be hard to find buyers. However, it does at least provide the ability to get some liquidity if you're in a non-traded REIT that is just not doing what you need it to do. So in that particular situation, Michelle, I am I probably both nailed it down. I'm splitting the baby on that one, right? So, all right. So listeners, once again, great job, Michelle. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Didn't pick on me too bad. Kip Winger's probably a little hurt, but he'll get over it. He and his millions he made in the 80s. I think he's still alive. I think he's still playing music. Progressive.
Lord help us.
That's right. All right, listeners, once again, as you heard, I totally didn't nail it on everything, but I think I had valid reasons when I was being a little off. I am learning to be more open-minded. I would say impressive maturity, wouldn't you say?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
You like that? All right, very good. Well, to our listeners that heard us discuss something that impacts them, particularly those of you in or near retirement, remember, you can reach out to us at Gulf Coast Financial Advisors to start a conversation. Call us at 251-333-5151, or you can find us on our website at gulfcoastfa.com. That's GULFCOAST. FA is in financialadvisor.com. Thank you to my lovely co-host, Michelle Lee Melton. Michelle, great job.
Thank you. You're welcome.
The crowd is cheering for you.
The crowd goes wild.
That's right. I want to give a thank you to our awesome radio station, 106.5 FM. That's Talk 106.5 FM. They're over in Mobile. Many thanks to the provider of our show music, local band Sloth Racer. That's Sloth like the animal. You can find them at slothracerband.com. And as always, my sincere appreciation for all of you out there that have been listening and joining Michelle and I on this journey. We'd love to be a part of your journey as well. Until we talk again next Sunday, have a wonderful and productive week. This has been Coasting Retirement with Josh Knoll.
Advisory products and services offered by investment advisor representatives through Prime Capital Investment Advisors, LLC, a federally registered investment advisor, PCIA at 6201 College Boulevard, Suite number 150, Overland Park, Kansas, 66211. PCIA doing business as Prime Capital Wealth Management and Qualified Plan Advisors. Certain services may be provided by PCIA affiliates. In this format, Josh Knoll provides general information, not individually targeted personalized advice, and is not liable for the usage of the information provided. Exposure to ideas and financial vehicles should not be considered investment advice or the recommendation to buy or sell any of these financial vehicles. This information should also not be considered tax or legal advice. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Investments will fluctuate and when redeemed may be worth more or less than when originally invested.